Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I am Patrick Curran, Chair of the Java Community Process Program, and this is Heather VanCura, who is the manager of the Program Management Office of the JCP. Heather helps, does all the work, and I get to come to conferences. I'm going to start this, and Heather is going to join us halfway through and do the second half of the presentation. So, you have anything to say, Heather, before you?
No, take it away. I'll be back later for the participation portion of the presentation. All
right, so thanks for coming. Got a lot of slides. I'm going to go fairly quickly. Hopefully I'll be able to get through them. I'm going to talk about standards and why they're important, how we create standards for Java, how the JCP is organized and structured, how it does its work, and how a number of initiatives that we have in progress for changing the way that we do our work, and then we'll talk about how people, developers, can get involved in the work that we do. I'm missing a slide here. Okay, standards are really important. Standards that we care about in the Java world fall into two categories. There are languages and protocols. How things speak to each other, communicate with each other, and interfaces, how stuff fits together. We create specifications. The standards developing process is about creating specifications, which you can think of as a set of rules or as blueprints, specifications for how things should work, how they should fit together. A specification by itself is not much use. I could have a blueprint for a helicopter and say, okay, there's an anti-gravity machine in there, that's what makes it work. So it's a blueprint for something that cannot be created. You need a testing and certification process to verify that things actually do work the way that they are supposed to work. So certification or quality testing is a critical part of the whole standards developing process. If you do this right, then people can mix and match their components. Unlike in the old days when you buy a machine from IBM, you are locked into IBM for life. These days, because we have standards, because we have multiple implementations of stuff, at least in theory, you can mix and match. You can buy components from different vendors, you can put them together, you can switch from one vendor to another, and our customers like that. If you want to build industrial strength systems, global systems, put stuff into space, global delivery mechanisms, air traffic control, ATM machines, and so on, you're going to want to build on top of standards. You're going to want the assurance that you have that level of flexibility, that stuff is well specified, well tested, and that you are not locked into any particular way of doing stuff. In the Java world, we are all about building standards, and we do this through a community collaborative process, unlike, for example, the Windows world, where what you get is what Microsoft says you should get. In the Java world, what we get is what you guys want, and the people who put this stuff together is not just Oracle, but all of the players in the Java ecosystem who really care about Java are able to participate. So all the different platforms, Java SE, Java ME, Java EE, have a whole bunch of different components or pieces, and each of these is specified. The interfaces between them are well specified, and this makes it possible for multiple vendors to implement them and for applications to be moved from one vendor's implementation to another. How we do this? We do this through the process of what we call Java specification requests, or JSRs. So a JSR is a single version of a specification, possibly for the entire platform. We would call that an umbrella JSR because it actually contains or references a whole bunch of different specifications for the different components. JSRs are developed by members of the Java community, who we call the specification lead, who gather a group of interested members to work with them in the process of developing a specification. The group is called the expert group, and they collectively do the work of developing the JSR. And anybody who is a member of the organization can submit and can lead a JSR, not just Oracle, but anybody. The expert group has three things that they must deliver, not just a spec, but an implementation of the spec that we call a reference implementation, and that must be a complete implementation of the spec. Everything must be there. And a conformance test suite we call a technology compatibility kit, or TCK, This is basically a test suite that can be used to verify that implementations do conform to the specification. So you have to build all three things together. They all kind of depend on each other because it's like all moving parts. While the spec is being developed, or once you get partway through the development of the spec, you actually start working on the TCK, on the tests, and you similarly start working on the reference implementation. And each of them supports the other pieces. So the process of creating a reference implementation, which is supposed to be a complete implementation of the spec, allows you to figure out whether or not the spec is implementable. You will find in the process of trying to implement it that sometimes the language is vague, something is missing, unspecified. So that is the real-world proof that the spec is actually implementable. The process of developing tests will find, again, problems in the spec, because if there are ambiguities, if there's something missing, when you try to build a test, you're going to find you can't do that. Process of running the test against the reference implementation will find bugs in the tests, will find bugs in the implementation. So each of these three pieces supports the other. This is a powerful model which is, I don't want to say unique to the JCP, but most standards organizations don't require a complete implementation. They certainly encourage it. And many of them, although everybody understands the value of conformance tests, most standards organizations don't default and require that a conformance test suite be delivered along with the specification. Since I'm in Antwerp, I thought I'd better throw in a picture, but there's a meaning to this. The guilds in the early days were responsible for doing quality control. The guilds who were responsible for goldsmiths or silversmiths, for example, made sure that the stuff that they produced met certain standards of quality. They would stamp them as such, so a silversmith would put a hallmark on a piece of silver which verifies a certain level of fineness or whatever. We do a similar thing, but we do it through what we call compatibility testing, or perhaps conformance testing, whereby we measure the extent to which implementations conform to the spec. And on the assumption that they do, we give our own hallmark, which is the Java brand. That's integral to the whole process that we are working on. Okay, so let's switch gears a little and talk about how the organization is structured. So I'm the chairperson. We have an executive committee. I'll say more about each of these later. But the executive committee kind of oversees the work that we do. We have the program management office, which is the group that Heather runs, that helps to do the day-to-day administration, working on maintaining our website and maintaining all the data about who is on the different JSRs and so on. The real work is done by these expert groups here, which are led by a spec lead, and you have a number of members from the organization participating. They're the guys who actually create the JSRs, and the members themselves get to participate in this whole process and also get to vote on who is on the executive committee. We have two documents that are important that define the organization and how we do our work. The first one is called the JSPA, which stands for Java Specification Participation Agreement, complicated term. This is a legal document, and it is big and complicated. It is actually the legal document that you sign when you join the organization, and its purpose is to address basically two areas: intellectual property rights. In other words, we want to make sure that if you participate in one of these expert groups and contribute something, that you have the right to do that, and that you are actually giving the rights to the intellectual property that you're contributing and any necessary patents and so on to the spec lead, so that they can in turn be passed on to implementers who will then be able to implement specifications secure in the knowledge that they have the right to do so, that the property trail has been maintained. The second thing the JSPA deals with is the terms under which the things that are produced, the specification, the RI, and the TCK, are licensed. And as I say, it's a real legal document, and if you read it, you'll find it's pretty complicated and pretty scary. More on that later. The process document is simpler, but still not completely simple. That defines the way the organization is structured, the way we do our work, the way that specs are developed and move through the process, and so on. Both of these are online. You can check them out. The presentation has a whole bunch of links in it, and I presume it will be made available to you later if you want to follow up. So again, briefly on the roles. So I'm the chair, I lead the organization, manage the PMO, Program Management Office, directly managed by Heather, manages day-to-day operations. The executive committee has two responsibilities: to vote on JSRs as they move through the process, more on that later, and to help define our governance and our processes and the JSPA itself, and I'll say more about that later too. Expert groups, as I say, create the JSRs and members can review and participate. So, executive committee, we used to have two of these. We used to have one for Java ME and one for Java SE and EE combined, but we've just recently smushed them together into a single committee. I'll say a little more on that later too. We meet about monthly on the phone, 3 times a year we meet face-to-face in various parts of the world, usually east coast of the US, west coast of the US, Europe. We did go to Brazil last year, we went to Korea the year before. We do our work out in public, so we have all of our meeting minutes and materials are posted on our website. And we do hold a couple of public teleconferences each year. It happens that next week we have one on next Tuesday. Details, I think, you can find on jcp.org. And we have a public mailing list whereby people can provide feedback to us. So we try to do things out in the open. As I said, the members of the executive committees are elected. We're in the process of doing this merge of the two committees, and we're actually reducing the total number of members. That process will finish next year, more on that later. When we're done, we'll have 25 members in all. Oracle gets a permanent seat on the executive committee. Then we have 16 what we call ratified seats and 8 open elected seats. With the ratified seats, Oracle selects someone and nominates them, says we think this would be a good member for the executive committee. And they do that based on geographical representation to make sure there is all the different interests within the Java ecosystem are represented and so on. These nominations do have to be approved by the membership in the election, and from time to time, if Oracle makes a mistake and nominates someone silly, the membership will say, no, that's a bad idea. That has happened. The other 8 seats are completely open. Anyone who's a member of the JCP can nominate themselves. And each year we will reconfirm or re-elect half of the members. If someone resigns, we can hold a special election to fill the seat. Executive committee has 2 responsibilities, as I said, review JSRs and evolve the JSPA and the process document. More on that evolution process later. Here's the current membership. We're actually a little under strength at the moment. We have some seats in reserve for next year when we are formally going to reduce the number. But we have a mixture of individuals. We have a couple of individuals, Stefano Andriani, Werner Kyle. We have, the usual suspects, the big implementers, Intel, IBM, HP, and so on. We have kind of end-user companies like Goldman Sachs and Credit Suisse, Google. We have a couple of Java user groups. So I think we're pretty well spread out, pretty well representing the different areas of the Java community. The 2 names in red are new members who are newly elected this year. Previously hadn't been on the executive committee. A little more on the roles. I'll go very quickly on this. The spec lead, as I said, basically responsible for leading the JSR. They get the IP rights to the technology, but they have an obligation to relicense that to anyone who wants to implement the specification. Oracle is the spec lead for the existing platforms, ME, SE, and EE. The expert group is recruited by the spec lead and does the work of developing the spec. The RI and the TCK are the spec lead's responsibility. Typically, the expert group doesn't get involved in them. Okay, our membership open to anyone. We've got about 1,200 members altogether, though we have 3 times that many people registered as casual participants and observers at jcp.org. Membership is free for anyone who licenses Java from Oracle, for individuals, for Java user groups, small fee for not-for-profits, and a slightly larger fee for commercial organizations. About 3/4 of our members are individuals now. Almost all the others are corporations. We do have a small number of non-profits, universities, open source groups, such as Eclipse Foundation and so on. And about half our members in North America, 1/3 in Europe and Russia, and most of the rest in Asia and Middle East. We are underrepresented I think, in Asia and South America, and we're trying to get a more global balance there. Okay, we have a formal process. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but the important point to take away here is that the development of a JSR is a very well-defined and formal process. You start by submitting it, there's a vote at that process, you produce an early draft, there is no vote on that, but the public reviews and comments. Once you get the specification reasonably well firmed up, you do what we call a public review, which is a formal publication of the spec. Again, more comments, and there is a vote by the executive committee at that point. At each of these stages, if the vote fails, the expert group has a brief period of time, usually I think it's 30 days, to kind of go back and fix stuff and resubmit, and sometimes they do that. If the second vote fails, the JSR is shut down. I don't think we ever have a case where a JSR is shut down in the middle, but we do have, from time to time, the submissions are rejected, and that proves the process is working. If someone comes up with a dumb idea, then typically the executive committee will say no, and that happens from time to time. You go on through the process, propose final draft, final ballot when all the pieces come together, the spec and the reference implementation and the TCK, and then we go into a maintenance mode. So this is all defined in the process document. I'm not going to go into the details. The subsequent slides, I have one slide on each of those stages, and again, I won't go into that, that's just for reference. Submission, review and approval, form the expert group, create an early draft, do a public review, propose final draft, release, and maintenance. And the stages are summarized here. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about how we change our constitution, how we define what we do, and how we change the way the organization functions. We have a formal process for doing this, constitutional change, and basically we use the process itself to change the process, because the output of a change is simply a modification to one of those two documents, the process document or the JSPA. Since we have a well-defined process for creating specs, a formal process, which is the JSR process, we figured we just use the same process to modify these documents. So that's what we do. We file JSRs. I act as the spec lead for these JSRs to modify the process, and the executive committee members collectively form the expert group. And a process change JSR goes through all of the same stages as a regular JSR, except, of course, there's no RI and TCK, but what you produce is a new version of either the process document or the JSPA, or both of them. So, we had worked on a series of 3 JSRs starting, I guess, a year and a half or so ago, to make a series of modifications to the way that we do our work. The first was JSR 348. We finished that in October 2011. And this JSR, we focused on relatively simple stuff. We wanted to get things moving again after quite a long period of things being quiet. So we set ourselves deliberately an aggressive timeline of about 6 months, and we said we'll pick the low-hanging fruit. We'll do the stuff that's easy to do, and anything complicated we'll punt to a later JSR. So we finished that one October 2011, indeed in about 6 months. 355 followed, and that was the one that merged the 2 ECs. More about that later. And then we've recently started 358, which is a much more complicated process because we're going to be modifying the JSPA as well as the process document. So the first of these, 348, focused primarily on transparency. In the old days, people used to say, those expert groups, you can never tell what they're doing. They're all working in smoke-filled rooms and so on in secret. So we said, okay, we're going to focus primarily on transparency, but also on enabling participation and some other changes to try and make things go smoothly and more quickly. Like I say, we did this quickly within 6 months, and the difficult stuff we postponed. I won't say more about this because Heather will be touching on this in more detail later. And specifically, we'll be talking about what we did and how this is being implemented today. The second JSR was very simple because it just merged the 2 executive committees. We did this because we expect to see Java ME and SE converge over time. So we figured there was no reason any longer to have separate executive committees. We used to have 16 members on each committee for a total of 32, so we said we would reduce the number to about 25, but we would keep the same ratio, 2-to-1, of ratified to elected seats. A couple of members had a seat on each committee, so we would give them up. Oracle used to have 1 seat on each. So Oracle gave up that extra seat, and similarly IBM had a seat on both committees, and they gave up that too. So the implementation plan was, and we're partway through this, merge the ECs, reduce the total number of members to 25. The merge took place this year after our elections in 2012, last month. So we are now merged. And at that point we said we would eliminate the 2 duplicate seats. We did that too. But we actually, as it turned out, we decided to keep some of those ratified seats in reserve so we have more flexibility next year when we actually formally reduce the number of members. People who had been elected in 2010 on a 3-year term, we said we would let them complete that term. So 2013 is where things get interesting because everybody's going to have to run for election again. There'll be fewer seats available than there are members. After that, we switched to a 2-year election cycle rather than a 3. So that was an easy one. It was simple. We're halfway through, and we will finish it off next year. The third one is the scary one. This is a big monster. And the reason is primarily because we're modifying the JSPA. This document hasn't been significantly modified since 2002, so it's 10 years old. There were some minor changes made in 2005. But since then, the organization and the world that we're working in has changed significantly. Much more open source work being done. In the early days, and you'll see this if you take the trouble to read the JSPA, it's reflected in there. The early days, the assumption was Oracle would do most of the work. People would license the stuff that Oracle did and would then create derivative works. That's not the way things are done anymore. So for a variety of reasons, we really need to change this, to clean it up, to update it. But it is complicated. I don't want to use the word fragile, but when you read it in detail, changing it is kind of like changing legacy code. You know, I can see pieces of it, and I know why they're there, but I know they don't really do anything anymore. But you've got to be really careful because the connections are potentially fragile, and if we make a mistake, we can break the IP flow, for example, or break licensing, and that would be not a good thing. So we've got to be really careful when we do this, and also, because it's a legal document, all the lawyers are going to get involved. IBM's lawyers and HP's lawyers and Eclipse's lawyers and on and on and on. And if you've ever tried to get even 2 or 3 lawyers in a room to agree on something, you'll realize it can take a long time. So we're going to have to manage this process really carefully. We have a long shopping list of stuff that we're going to work on. At the top of the list is the IP flow. At the moment it's kind of convoluted, and people make grants, and those grants go to the spec lead, and then the spec lead in turn licenses on to implementers. You've got to deal with copyright, you've got to deal with patents. We want to see if we can simplify that process. We want to make sure that we maintain compatibility because that's one of Java's strengths. So that's tied into the notion of licensing and the requirement that implementations be compatible. But we want to look at the licensing model. We have a whole variety of licenses today because each spec lead can choose their own license. So if you want to put together a system and you're licensing things from a bunch of different JSRs, you may be dealing with a bunch of different licenses. We'd like to bring some regularity and some consistency to that and have a smaller number of kind of recommended licenses. We want to make sure that people are free to create independent implementations, that is, those that don't derive from the work of the spec lead. We want to investigate and make sure that we understand the role of the RI. We have some oddities with individuals as opposed to corporations. We want to make sure that that's handled appropriately. We made a bunch of transparency changes in JSR 348, but we need to check to make sure there's nothing in the JSPA that kind of contradicts that or that inhibits transparency. We want to try and make the JSPA simpler, and so on and so on. We've got a lot of stuff on our list. We have an issue tracker, and there's an issue for each of these and for many more. And if you're interested, you can take a look. This matters because the JSPA is really the foundation of everything that happens in Java. This is what defines the way that IP is granted as people collectively create these JSRs. And it defines the terms under which the stuff is licensed to others. And therefore, this whole process ensures that the different implementations of Java are compatible, that they conform to the spec. It ensures that the technologies that we bring into Java are safe from an IP perspective. In other words, we know who owns it, and the ownership is clear, and the ownership has been granted, so that we can then pass that on to implementers, and people who implement these technologies can do so knowing that they have clear legal right to do so. So, this work has only started relatively recently. We have a Java.NET project. If you go to the home page, it will explain how to get involved. We have an observers mailing list so that everything the expert group discusses is mirrored to that. We have an issue tracker, which is where all of our issues are listed, and that's probably the best place if you have suggestions or comments. The best place to drop them would be to actually comment the particular issue. It's publicly writable. You have to have a Java.NET login, but otherwise you can actively participate. And the documents that we produce, our source materials and our output, are available in a document archive. So take a look if you're interested, and follow us, provide us with some comments and some feedback. We very much want to hear what you have to say. So I'm winding down. The result of all this is that I think we've done a good job of removing barriers to participation. You don't have to join the JCP in order to participate. You get more benefits if you do. You can work directly on an expert group, but if you're just a casual observer, you can still see what we're doing, you can still participate, you can join the mailing list, you can comment, and so on. So anybody can participate, and you can participate in two ways. As you know, if you're interested in the implementation, then you can join OpenJDK or Project Glassfish, and you can actually contribute to the implementation of the specs. But if you want to kind of get in the earlier stage and define what goes into the specs, then you need to participate through the JCP in the work of the JSRs as they're being developed. So, if you guys are the consumers of all this stuff, if you care about and you want to influence the direction that Java takes, then you can no longer say it's too difficult or there are barriers. You can just do it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather, who will talk in more detail about the participation process, how the transparency stuff is going, and in general, say more about how you guys can participate. So Heather, there you go.
Thank you. All right. So this is the more exciting part, or the fun part. All right. To me, anyway. Okay. So just as Patrick said before, now all JSRs are operating in a more transparent fashion, and the changes that are implemented that all the JSRs are following go along these three themes: transparency, participation, and agility. Like Patrick said, no more smoky rooms, and the changes around transparency were really in two areas. One on how the JSRs operate, and then the other on how the executive committee operates. So both of those things should be transparent to you. These are the changes that you should see in all of the active JSRs that are happening through the JCP right now. So all of the JSRs that are actively working, and I have a list, a few slides forward for your reference when you go and download the presentation and take a look. You can see, but the two main changes really are that all JSRs now have a public issue tracker, and they also have a public mailing list. And the requirements were put around the fact that the expert group and the spec lead must actually respond to those comments that are put in there. In addition, all the licensing terms for JSRs need to be disclosed in the beginning of the process versus at the end. And then for the executive committee, some of the changes were implemented so that you can actually see the work that's going on in the executive committee. One of those things is having the public EC meetings. Since the EC meetings are throughout the year, we have at least 2 opportunities for you to listen into one of those meetings and to suggest agenda items. We have one on Tuesday coming up on November 20th, and the call-in details are on jcp.org, and that will also be recorded if you can't make it on the 20th, and that's available for listening anytime. There's also a list where you can post issues that you have for the EC, and we've formalized some of the processes that the EC operates under for some time. These are more formalized now and available as links under the JCP2 process document. And there's a formal process if there are issues that arise going on with the community. You can actually take your issues to the EC, and there's a formal process that's become part of the JCP itself. So moving on to the second area where we made these changes in JSRs and the executive committee or participation. And for the expert groups as well, this focuses a lot on the expert group nominations. So all of the nominations now for expert groups are public. The spec lead and expert group must respond to anybody who would like to participate in an expert group and say why they're being accepted or not. And there's also a process for dealing with any issues that should arise within the expert groups. And the EC members now have some participation requirements for themselves as well, so they can lose their voting privileges if they miss meetings, and if they continue to miss meetings, they can ultimately forfeit their executive committee seat. We did have a few members where that took effect last year. We had 3 members that lost their seats on the executive committee. And the third area of changes is around agility. We had for some time, probably 3 or 4 years, the idea of inactive JSRs, which if you've been following what's going on in the JCP, you might have heard that term inactive JSR, which wasn't really formal until the last 13 months. We've established an idea of timeouts. We're calling it JSR Deadlines. So every JSR has certain timeline that they must meet to continue to progress through the process. So they're not sitting there for years. They have 9 months to make the early draft review, and then a year from that to make the public review, and another year from that to progress to final release. And there are renewal ballots that will happen if those timelines are not being met. And there were also some changes put in place to help streamline the process around maintenance and final release. A lot of times there was some delay in getting those things published and available to the community, as well as a process when over time those links may break. So now there are consequences if those links do break and they're not remedied within 30 days. So the result is really that the JCP is working now easier for anyone in the community to participate, to make it by the community for the community. And now we really need to have your participation in order to take full advantage of these changes that have been put in place. So this was the progress report that I was telling you about, where you can view for the next 4 slides or so, we will list all of these JSRs. So these 30 JSRs, right now in the JCP, we're up to 360 in the numbers, but there really are just about 30 JSRs that are actively progressing through the process in earlier stages. And 3/4 of these JSRs are actually already operating under JCP 2.8 or above. So they're already subject to all the requirements that I just went through. We haven't had any renewal ballots yet. We've had 10 new JSRs, but that means that we've actually had 13 JSRs where the spec leads have voluntarily moved to these new procedures for transparency and participation. And actually that's out of date because I had 1 JSR post this morning. JSR 310 moved to JCP 2.9 this morning. So now we have 14 JSRs that have migrated, only 1 that's in process, and still we have 7 that are not quite migrated. So we need to work on those JSRs and get them moved over. But these are the JSRs where you can actively play a part and participate in the development of these JSRs. And I'm going to go through in the next portion of my talk where I'm going to go through, there are 5 different programs where your participation is needed, and that's where you kind of get into the 101 ways, since each one of those has at least 25 ways to participate and where it needs your community involvement, participation, and feedback. So these are the migrated JSRs. And 310 is moved, so we have just 1 that's still in the process of moving, getting there. And these are our 7 JSRs that are actively moving, just still under JCP 2.7. So we're working with them to move them to the current procedures. So this is how you can get involved. Everyone's welcome. And kind of why you want to participate. Well, if you can participate in lots of different ways. If you're a corporation, obviously it gives you a corporate advantage. You can get involved in the technologies that you're incorporating into your implementations, time to market. If you're an individual, you can fulfill some of your altruistic tendencies, and you could also get some great experience for your resume and make great contacts. And last but not least, of course, you can have fun while doing it. Look at the things that you're interested in that list of JSRs and find one that you'd like to enjoy spending some time with. So starting out with how you can participate as yourself, that's fine, but what we've been working on a lot in the last couple of years is really embracing the Java user groups and trying to pull them into the community. And we have waived the membership fee, like Patrick said. That's no charge to Java user groups who'd like to join the JCP, can work with each other and help each other. Currently we have about 34 Java user group members. We have this list on the website jcp.org under members. You can click and see the list. Several of these from Europe. We're always interested in growing this list, so you're welcome to join. And I have later in the presentation a link on how you do it, but if you need help, I'm happy to help you out with that. We did have two Java user groups that progressed further and are participating on the executive committee, so kind of at the highest level of the organization. And these two Java user groups have already made significant contributions to the JCP, starting with, they've introduced Adopt-a-JSR, which probably a lot of you have heard of. I don't know, has anyone heard of Adopt-a-JSR? Not really. Okay, well, so pretty early on into the London Java community's tenure in the EC, they were elected about 18 months ago first. They saw a need for involvement of the Java user groups in the standards. So this is a kind of a formalized way to have your Java user group participate in the standards development without doing it just as an individual, but kind of pull together your resources within your Java user group, pick a JSR that you're interested in, maybe pick one from that list of 30 that's going on now, and contact the spec lead and find out what they're needing and how you can get involved with them. And I'm going to list some ways that you can do that, some suggestions, but really it's limitless. You can help out in any way that you think needs help and that the spec lead agrees is a good fit. So these were the motivations behind the Adopt-a-JSR program. And that earlier I showed there's a URL for that. It's a java.net project. So you can find it there. There's actually a link to the Adopt-a-JSR from the homepage of java.net. I believe it's in the top left corner, link to Adopt-a-JSR. And this is how you would join. You can either contact your Java user group leader, or you can go follow the link I mentioned and join the project. So if you're a java.net member, just click join this project and sign up for their mailing list. And we've got 2 slides here, some suggestions for how people have gotten involved through the Adopt-a-JSR program with JSRs that are happening. JSR 310 is probably the best example of this. But I started out on this slide really more kind of simple, basic tasks that help relieve the spec lead of some of their responsibilities. As Patrick mentioned earlier in the presentation, the spec leads have a lot of work to do, delivering the spec and the RI and the TCK and making sure they incorporate all the different viewpoints within the expert group. So that's a lot of work. You can help with all of these things that the spec lead could be relieved from these responsibilities. Things like documentation, monitoring the mailing list, helping to steer the conversation, helping out with their infrastructure. Since we do have all these new requirements, it does take some time from the spec lead to actually set up a public issue tracker and set up the comments aliases and actually watch those and monitor them and manage them. And if you're looking to get more involved, these are some of the activities that have also been utilized in the Adopt-a-JSR program, helping out with testing the early RA builds, helping with triaging of the issues, helping give feedback and moderate those, and then actually building the RI and the TCK. Those are actually some things that can be done. So you can break it up into smaller chunks, or even the last year or so, I think there have been some Java user groups have been organizing hackathons where you get together and actually break it down into a smaller piece and produce some meaningful contributions. You can also start your own Adopt-a-JSR project if you don't see the JSR that you're interested in on the Adopt-a-JSR project. There's some instructions and links of how you'd go about setting that up. One of the things I mentioned earlier is transparency checks. So now, since it's been about 13 months since we've had JCP 2.8, the progress has been made, and we are interested in finding out how these spec leads and expert groups are doing in implementing the transparency changes. So this is a list that we provide to all of the spec leads. It's a transparency checklist. Basically, it incorporates everything I talked about before, talking about the participation and the transparency and the agility. It's something for them to keep in mind as they set up their project. But we're actually going to take it a step further, and we're asking for volunteers. Through the Adopt-a-JSR program, we're creating a transparency sub-project to help us gauge how these spec leads are doing and the expert groups along with them. So there's a project that's you can find from the Adopt-a-JSR wiki. You scroll down, it's under intermediate. We're still kind of building it out, so it will grow larger. It's just starting this month. But that's an opportunity for you to provide qualitative and quantitative feedback to the community, to the spec lead, to the expert groups, and to the program management office, which is us, and we can follow up and address anything that needs fine-tuning there. And that will feed into a matrix where everyone can see kind of a scorecard of how these JSRs are doing. I think I may have gotten ahead of myself on my slides. So, yeah. All right. So this is kind of the outline of what the survey is going to look like. So if you go take a look, you can actually see a draft format of it. It should be formalized and ready for participants later in next week. And kind of as the next step from Adopt-a-JSR, there's also Adopt-Open-JDK. So if you're interested in working on the implementation of the Open-JDK project, there's also a link to Adopt-Open-JDK. It has similar resources for you there. So that's kind of moving on now to my fifth thing, which is the actual JCP. So it's still possible to actually participate through the JCP. These additional programs are ways for it to be easier for you to do it without joining the JCP, but we still encourage people to join the JCP. As Patrick mentioned, that is in getting involved with the Java Specification Participation Agreement, or the JSPA. So anybody can join the JCP. It just requires signing the JSPA. It's free for nonprofits, Java user groups, and individuals. No charge. $5,000 for corporation. And this is the link to go and download the JSPA and fill it out. Once you're joining the JCP, you become a member. These are the different levels of membership in the JCP. So members review the specs themselves and provide feedback to the expert groups. Being a member also gives you the opportunity to nominate yourself to serve on an expert group as new JSRs are filed. They are always open for nominations, and you're free to nominate yourself. Usually, expert group members are experts in their field, so they can say they bring a certain value or have some reason to bring diversity to the expert group. That's one of the things that's in the transparency checklist. If you saw earlier that we want to have a balanced expert group. We want to see competing implementations coming together. So one of the goals of the expert group nomination process is to ensure that we have a balanced expert group. So any member can nominate themselves to serve on an expert group of a JSR. And the expert group members are responsible for writing the spec, developing the RI, and the TCK. And specification leads, and again, if you're a member, anyone can submit a JSR to lead the JSR. Usually how it works is if you submit the JSR, you lead the JSR, and you carry it through to completion. That's a significant time commitment. Probably the highest time commitment that you can have in the JCP, and definitely should be a leading expert in the field for this. And the highest level is executive committee member. So if you feel you have the time commitment and motivation to serve on the executive committee, you'll be working on JCP.next efforts that Patrick detailed earlier, which would be the governance and the terms of membership, working on the JSPA, working on evolving the process itself, and that's a moderate to high time commitment depending on how much you would put into it. So this is the reason you would do all of these things. You would do it to advance your career, to improve your skills, grow your network, make new contacts, lots of negotiation, documentation, verbal skills, teamwork are all skills that are really essential to success in the process of Java standardization. And of course, don't forget that it's fun, so that can always be the reason to do it. So, make the future Java. And we left some time for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Now, about the EC, we're trying to make things transparent here. But
Yeah.
the EC, there's all these ratified seats. Why don't we have a 100% elected EC?
Well, I think Patrick should answer that
Yes,
question.
the answer is because we've always done it the other way, and because this does allow us to make sure that we have a diversity of membership. If we had purely elected seats, I'm not sure that we would get the same broad industry representation that we have at the moment. I know that Oracle puts, and when we were Sun before, we put a lot of effort into looking around and saying, well, we don't have anyone from this kind of area of the community, and we would go out and we would hunt for additional members to kind of fill gaps. So that may not be the best answer for you, but we've talked about making that change, and interestingly enough, the majority of people on the executive committee today, even those who are elected members, tend to say, well, we get a better breadth of representation with this current process. It seems to work reasonably well. We are always interested in hearing suggestions for nominations, so we ought to try and open that up maybe a little more formally, and we can certainly talk about that. And I guess the last point I would make is, don't forget that there is an election involved here, and the first time Oracle actually went through this process, they made a mistake. They nominated a company that was not well known, and the membership took one look at it and said, no, that's a bad idea, and they voted it down. So it may not be perfect, but it does work as it is at the moment. More questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So what's the difference between a JSR and a JAP?
The JAP is, I think, that's the process they use for within the OpenJDK, right? Okay. So the JSR is the defining the specification. So it's a formal process for defining the spec. The JAP is a way of proposing a particular implementation, or perhaps proposing something that would ultimately result in a JSR. So because they're doing work within OpenJDK, it can be done in a kind of experimental fashion. So you could have a JAP that says, how about if we had this new language feature, for example? And it would be discussed and voted on in a more informal manner, but still in a well-defined manner within OpenJDK. And at a certain point, if there was agreement that it was a good idea, then at that point it might make it into an existing JSR, for example, the kind of umbrella JSR that does all the language changes, or it might be significant enough that it would result in a JSR in itself. So they're kind of like parallel processes, but they feed into each other.
And another question.
Yeah.
What if I have a great idea? I write a spec for a feature, and I write an implementation, and I might want to experiment with DCK. Is that possible right now?
You mean as an individual, is it possible for you to?
Or a small group?
Yes, of course. I mean, that's exactly what the process is about. So you start by submitting the JSR. Actually, what you should do is start by gathering a collection of people to help you, because you don't want to do this as an individual. It's a very time-consuming process. A good way to do it would be to start with an open source project where you can actually begin to play with some ideas, because you don't want to standardize too early. It's better if you have reached some kind of consensus, and you may even have some partial implementations. So start there, but then the process would be that you would submit the JSR. You would say, I or my group would be the spec lead, and then assuming that the JSR was approved, you are then responsible for moving it through the process. So that is for formalizing the specification, for developing a reference implementation, and for developing a TCK. But I'll warn you that this is a significant time commitment.
Yeah.
Stephen Coburn, who runs the date and time JSR 310, now with some help from Oracle, has been doing this for 3 years or more. And he was fortunate enough, I think, recently to get a job where they allowed him to work on it half-time. But he's found it very difficult to do as an individual. You really want to be doing it as a group. But for sure, you can do it. You know, what we want is more JSRs, and they don't all have to come from big corporations. They can come from the developer community. That might be one of the next steps that would come out of the involvement of Java user groups, for example. Once people become more familiar with the process and the way things work, we might get to the stage where a Java user group says, well, okay, here's something that we could do as a group and push it through the process. But short answer, yes, very much possible for you to do this. That's the way the process is set up.
I have a final question, for me, a final question.
Okay.
When do you need a new JSR, or when can you put something in the maintenance of an existing JSR?
Okay, I should be repeating these questions. When do we need a new JSR? When can you modify an existing JSR? Basically, the maintenance releases are intended to be only for very small changes. And typically, typically it would be tweaks, it would be performance enhancements. If you're going to introduce new APIs, you really should be doing that in a new JSR. We don't have a hard and fast rule, but certainly when I was at Sun involved in the other side of this, that was what I would always tell people. If you're going to be introducing new APIs, then you really need to do a new JSR. So you can think of it, it's almost like, is this a dot release or is it a major release? Yeah? We have like 3-4 minutes left. Anybody else have any questions? Last chance? Okay, then I think we're done. We'll be around, so if you do have any additional questions, by all means, just track us down. And as we mentioned earlier, we have public mailing lists and so on. So there are a number of ways you can reach us. Thank you for your attention.